Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 59. Before we get into today's questions, big thanks as usual to our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. And it's been a while since we have had an interview with Andy Blow. He's been on the show quite a few times already. But I want to remind you that we've talked about hydration and electrolytes in detail in previous episodes with Andy. And in particular, episode 49 was the one where we really covered how hydration and electrolytes may impact your performance in endurance events and how critical it is, especially when you're doing longer events in hot and humid conditions. So go and check out episode 49 to learn more about why hydration and electrolytes is so important. And if you want to try your first box or tube of electrolytes for free, you can use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, on precisionhydration.com. And big thanks as well to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka is the leading manufacturer of wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear. And they're used by some of the best sports in triathlon, as well as other sports for that matter. But people in the triathlon world that you will have heard of that are using Roka include Katie Zafiris, Flora Duffy, Mario Mola, and on the long distance side, for example, Lucy Charles. So it's really a who's who of triathlon, and you can understand why, because their products are really amazing. It's almost a case of you have to try them to believe them. You can get 20% off your entire order on roka.com with the promo code TTS, all caps. So let's get on to the first question for today, and this one is from Patrick in the United Kingdom, who writes, "Hey Michael, really enjoying the podcasts, lots of great info as always. I wanted to put forward a question for the podcast. I'm a recreational cyclist from the UK who likes to do road races, criteriums, and then later in the year hill climbs. One aspect I'm really struggling with is how to approach the base phase of my season. I have 7 to 8 hours a week to train and don't often get the chance to do long rides, maybe once or twice per month. Given that my races are no longer than 2 hours or around 60 minutes for the crits, what would be a good approach to really put the blocks in place for specificity later on? I can never seem to decide and therefore never build a proper base in the early part of the season. My power is from 1 minute to 15 minutes progress, but I really want to make a big leap over the winter by building that solid base." All right. Thank you, Patrick, for your question. It's a really good one. And first, I'm sure you have listened to it already because I believe your question came in some time ago. But if you have not, check out episode 201, which is on base training. And I did that with James and Lockie, the other coaches here at Scientific Triathlon. So we go into a lot of detail there about what to think about in the base training phase. But to give you some specifics based on the context that you're writing about, you're actually phrasing the question really well when you mention putting the building blocks in place now for specificity later. So your races obviously are intense, as they are for most of us. Maybe the Ironman would be the exception, but let's not get into that now. Either way, your races are intense and they will require intensity in training. So this time of year, what's really important is that you build a foundation fitness that will then later on allow you to do that intense training to benefit from that and be able to translate that into race performances. So to build that foundation fitness, that's not to say that you should not do any intensity now. And if you listen to that episode that I mentioned, 201, you already know that all of us agreed that you don't have to go out and do just long, slow distance. But to play devil's advocate, there is maybe a case for doing that. There are a lot of athletes and coaches that have been very successful with that approach. Generally, though, I would say that it's more appropriate for really high-level athletes. But one example is Arthur Lydiard, and his approach was for the first 4 or maybe 5 months of base training, he would just go out and run at not necessarily slow distance actually, but you wouldn't do any specific intensity, but you would just go and do 100 miles week after week after week. And some of that might be actually as fast as what we might call tempo pace. But overall, the main objective and what happens when you do that sort of training, with most of it being that low intensity zone 1, zone 2 type training, is that you build that strong aerobic base. And Lydiard and his athletes then used it later on to do a lot of really, really intense work when they were approaching the racing season, and obviously to great effect. And this way of training is actually, we see some similar things happening in World Tour cycling teams, actually, where they tend to go out and do a lot of riding in the mountains during their base training without much specific intervals or things like that, if any. Sometimes they might go hard uphill, but it's not the structured type of training that we are used to these days. And but that works. It obviously works. So, but that being said, to mostly do this sort of long, slow distance training, it does require quite a bit of time, I would say. So that's why it's not necessarily what I would recommend for most age group athletes, but I just wanted to put that out there and show that there are many different ways to skin a cat. So either way, for base training for you, the main objective, and for anybody, the main objective is to build the foundational attributes that will allow you to then take on and absorb more training stress later on. So we want a strong aerobic foundation, and we want to prepare you metabolically and cardiovascularly for that hard work to come. We want to build structural resilience and readiness with some good strength and conditioning work, and we want a good biomechanical foundation. So let's elaborate a bit on these topics. In terms of the strength and conditioning, building structural resilience and readiness, this will look very different depending on the individual, but the main objectives of the strength and conditioning that you would do would be to first, achieve the minimum required mobility and functional mobility, specifically, to be able to ride comfortably for as long as needed without any loss of efficiency or increased risk of injury. Then we also want to do the S&C, to learn how to activate or fire different muscle groups effectively to reduce risk of injury. That can happen, for example, when you have imbalances and some other muscle groups need to overcompensate for a particular muscle group not pulling their share of the work. But also this firing of the right muscle groups and learning how to activate the right muscle groups, that works to improve your exercise economy so you can go harder for the same amount of oxygen. And we also finally want to move through your strength training periodization in a safe and efficient way that eventually will lead to improved maximum force and then rate of force development. And these are the aspects that will then translate into improved exercise economy. On the biomechanics side that I mentioned, this actually plays into what I already said about the functional mobility and muscle group activation. They play into the biomechanics quite a bit, but let's talk about specifically the biomechanics on the bike and biomechanic development on the bike. It doesn't have to be anything complex, but the main thing that I would recommend is to include work at a wide range of cadences, all the way from below 50 or below 60 up until well above 100. I've talked about cadence many times before in several Q&A episodes, and the main take-home message has always been to train at a wide range of cadences because that is beneficial. There are benefits to training at very low cadences and benefits to training at very high cadences. High cadences are great neuromuscular stimuli. They cause, obviously, you have to then do fast, repeated muscle contractions, and that will force your brain and your nervous system to work quickly and to form efficient motor patterns. And low cadences, on the other hand, especially when they are done at moderately high power outputs to high power outputs, that's great for practicing muscle fiber recruitment and almost like increasing the pool of available muscle fibers that you have available to you in cycling, and also make different muscle fibers more resistant to fatigue. And finally, on the biomechanics side, obviously adapting to the bike position, if that's something that you need. This might be a good time of year to go and have your bike fit updated. And if you are going to do that, the earlier the better, because then you have more time to work in your new position and adapt to that position. And then finally, when we get to the aerobic foundation side of things, the number one thing here is just consistent training. And for you, even though 7 to 8 hours per week isn't a huge volume, as long as you can do that consistently week in, week out, it ends up being a very significant amount of training at the end of the year and a great stimulus for improvement. So 8 hours per week, for example, if you do that, then it ends up being more than 400 hours of training per year, which is a very respectable amount. So there's no shame in that. And definitely that's the number one thing to look for, getting that consistent exposure, the frequent exposure to training. But then we come to the real crux of your question with the long rides. And I do think that to maximize the improvements in your aerobic fitness and your aerobic foundation, you should try to do some longer rides. But that doesn't mean that you have to go out and do 5 to 6 hour rides. You really don't. I do think, however, that you should try to do at least 1 3-hour ride at least every other week. And it sounds like you might have the option to do that from what I read into your question. And if on top of that, you can add a couple of medium duration rides, so 2 to 2.5 hours over the course of each 2-week block, then that would be a great added benefit as well. So, for example, a typical week for you could be to do 1 3-hour ride, 1 2-hour ride, and then 3 1-hour rides. And that would work out to be 8 hours. And then the next week, you might not need to do the 3-hour ride. So you could do something as simple as 3 times 2 hours plus 2 times 1 hours, or maybe even 2 times 2 hours and 4 times 1 hours, depending on your available time windows. I would say that some of the longer rides that you do should be just easy aerobic, so staying in zone 2. But I would not object to adding some longer tempo work to 1 or 2 of these long or medium duration rides. You might start with something as simple as 45 minutes at tempo and then gradually increase the duration from there. And also you can combine some of the different types of work mentioned. So for example, you can include high cadence work in the early parts of your long ride. That actually works great as a part of your warm-up. And then in the main set, you could do some low cadence work at a tempo intensity. There are many different ways to go about things, of course, but this should give you an idea of how you can tackle this. But to specifically answer your concern about not being able to ride really long more than once per month, as long as you can keep some of those medium to semi-long duration rides, you'll go a long way with that. And it's certainly better to consistently be getting in those 2 to 3 hour rides than to not do that and then just do an epic 5 to 6 hour ride once per month. So again, that consistency is going to trump that really long epic ride. I hope this helps, Patrick, and good luck with your training. The next question that we have is from Miguel in Mexico. And Miguel writes, "Hello, Michael. This is my second Q&A email for you. Thanks a lot for taking time to answer my questions, and also thanks for the amazing content you put out each week. Question 1. In episode 177, Dr. Steven Seiler mentioned that low-intensity training for endurance athletes shall be below the athlete's first lactate or ventilatory threshold. On the other hand, in episode 186, Alan Cousins mentioned a couple of times that low-intensity training shall be in or around the first lactate/ventilatory threshold, plus minus 10 beats per minute. For all around the first lactate threshold. So my question is, which one of these two approaches would you prefer to prescribe your athletes and why? Is there any risk to go anaerobic if you are training right on the first threshold, as Alan suggests? So for me personally, I tend to distinguish between general endurance workouts and then your more specific LT1 or aerobic threshold workouts. The endurance workouts that I prescribe are done at a pretty wide range of heart rate or pace or power, and that goes up until that first threshold, up until LT1. But the athlete certainly shouldn't feel pressed that they have to be at the high end of that range. They should feel comfortable. They should be able to hold a conversation. And then where in that range that they end up being, it doesn't matter. This is just general low-intensity training. And if all of the above is true, so they feel comfortable, they can hold a conversation, etc., and they end up even potentially being slightly faster than the high end of that range, that's not a big deal either. I want the athlete to be able to feel that this was actually a low intensity workout. And if they do, then that's all fine. Because maybe what ended up happening was that they simply ran an unusually flat course or something like that. And then naturally the pace will be slightly faster for the same effort and the same physiological output than if you run your normal hilly or undulating course. So, and even if there are parts of a workout where you are a bit above your first threshold, your LT1, which, by the way, is of course a moving target, and we can't pinpoint it to 1 beat per minute or anything like that. But even if we could, and we have an estimate for that, and you are spend some time above that, it does not ruin your workout. There's no magic switch going on there. Intensities all fall on a continuum. Obviously, there's no need when you're doing low intensity to try to necessarily force things and always have to be at the upper end of the target range, and you don't want to be spending the majority of your workout time actually above what your target intensity zone is, whether you're using pace or heart rate or whatever. But what I'm saying here is that if you end up spending 5 or 10 minutes of a 1 hour workout that is slightly above what you have set to be your first lactate threshold, then that's not the end of the world. And nothing bad really will come out of it. But just don't make it a habit to train harder than prescribed, but know that how you feel also has a big correlation with what's actually going on physiologically in your body, as long as if you're actually in tune with your body. And that is why it's very important to learn to be in tune with your body as well. So that was the endurance or general endurance workout, the zone 2 workout. Then I also prescribe more specific LT1 workouts. And these, I personally tend to prescribe a narrow range actually. It tends to end up being maybe around 8 beats per minute. So usually from around 5 beats per minute lower than LT1 up to 3 beats per minute higher than LT1. Honestly, I don't think that it needs to be this narrow, and I don't think that this approach is any better than the wider range of Alan Couzens, or better than, as Steven Seiler says, keeping it below the first lactate threshold. Personally, I would say that maybe if you go 10 beats per minute higher than that threshold, then I would personally consider that a bit too high. But again, RPE, breathing rate, and ability to hold a conversation will also play a role there. And in some cases, it might be fine if all of those are really under control and the athlete really feels that, hey, I am at my lactate, my first threshold or below that, and they are an experienced athlete and they are in tune with their body. That's totally fine. But maybe to give a general guideline, I would prefer to cap it at 5 beats per minute above the first lactate threshold. 10 beats per minute below, I would say that's perfectly fine. What ends up happening anyway in most cases is that you might target that 10 beats per minute for the start of your workout, and you end up getting there pretty quickly. But then over the course of the workout, you warm up, and you might even start to go a little bit harder as you warm up, and then heart rate also might rise to closer to that LT1 or the aerobic threshold. So maybe that would be a wider but good general recommendation from my side: 10 beats per minute below up to 5 beats per minute above the LT1. And finally, to answer that question about whether there's any risk of going anaerobic, there's always some lactate production going on in the body at any intensity. Going above the aerobic threshold is not going to ruin the effects of the workout. But the point that Steven Seiler is making is that if you constantly end up drifting into that moderate intensity zone, then over time that accumulates into fatigue and is not beneficial for your training improvements. So that's why it's important to pay attention to that, but also equally, as I mentioned already quite a few times, you need to be in tune with your body as well. Okay, so the second question from Miguel is, based on your background in medical equipment, what characteristics shall one look for when buying a blood lactate meter? Is there any brand or model you would recommend? So I looked into this obviously before buying a lactate meter myself, and I looked into some research on reliability and accuracy. And then the other main factor, or an important factor, is price of the device itself, but more importantly, the price of the test strips, because over time that ends up being quite a lot. So I did look at all of those factors, and then I also asked around. I asked some top physiologists for their recommendations. And to sum up, there's no clear no-brainer. There are a few good options out there. But what I ended up getting was the Lactate Plus, and it is one of the devices that research has shown is among the most accurate. And the other great thing about this device is that the strips tend to be a bit cheaper than most other meters. I linked to one peer-reviewed publication that compared 3 of the most common blood lactate devices. They are the Lactate Pro, the Lactate Plus, and the Lactate Scout. I'll link to that in the show notes. And but basically, to read off the abstract here, just quickly to give you the rundown, this study showed that the Lactate Pro and Lactate Plus compared well to each other, displayed good reliability and accuracy when compared to a laboratory-based analyzer. Although the Lactate Scout also displayed relatively good reliability, it was not as reliable or accurate as the Lactate Plus or Lactate Pro. And then on the pricing side of things, I just looked up on amazon.co.uk what the cost for, and I used that because they have both Lactate Pro strips and Lactate Plus test strips, so I could compare the pricing from the same provider. And on there, a box of 25 Lactate Pro strips costs £57, and the Lactate Plus box of 25 strips costs £45. So it ends up being almost 50 pence per strip in pricing difference, which with just a few tests, it actually starts to add up suddenly. So that's why on the pricing side, Lactate Plus is a really good choice. And so this is what I based my research on, and I have the Lactate Plus, as I said, and I'm happy with it. But there are plenty of other options, so it might depend on if you can get some sort of deal as well, find a good discount or anything like that. And question 3 from Miguel is, are 2-minute steps useful when performing a metabolic ramp test, or shall we look for a longer duration in each stage of the ramp? Thanks in advance and have a great day. So no, I don't think that 2-minute steps are enough at all. I think you should look for 5-minute stages. I would accept 4-minute stages, but when I see tests go down to 3-minute stages, that's when I start to question the validity of the test. And that's despite, I know that a lot of labs do use 3-minute steps, but if I were to look for a test and go in a lab, I would honestly start to look for another test provider if the lab that I'm looking at provides only 3-minute stages, just to make sure that you get accurate results from your testing. And based on, from everyone I talked to in top-level exercise physiology, 5-minute steps seem to be the well-accepted gold standard, and the 4 minutes is just a bit of, for me personally at least, I tend to think that it's probably pretty close at least, so I can live with that. But 3 minutes, it starts to be far enough from that 5-minute gold standard that that's when I get a bit skeptical. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for your questions, Miguel and Patrick, and everybody keep sending in those questions. I have a quick house cleaning item, and that's actually that my messaging function on the Scientific Triathlon Facebook page was blocked for some reason by Facebook. So if you're sending messages there, I'm not really able to read them, and especially not reply to them. I basically can't access the messaging function, so please send your questions as emails, michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. And hopefully Facebook will unblock that messaging function. They just did that without providing any reason. So that was a bit annoying, but let's see if it ends up being unblocked. And this, by the way, is as of early November 2019, just in case you're listening to in the future when the messaging function might be working again. Big thanks before we go to Precision Hydration. Go and get a free hydration plan on precisionhydration.com to get an idea of how much fluid and electrolytes you should consume in your next race. And use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box or tube for free. And big thanks to Roka. You can check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear on roka.com and get 20% off your entire order with the promo code TTS, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.